Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and a warm welcome to this SICC webinar on the Biden administration and its Indo-Pacific priorities. We're here thanks to our partnership with Chamber Member Brunswick, and thanks to its convening and enabling power, we're very honored and privileged to have Bob Zoellick with us. Mr. Zoellick has had a stellar career as a public servant and is well known to this region and has close links with this region and understanding of this region, not the least of which was being intimately involved with the Singapore-US FTA. It is probably the curse of American administrations that when they come into office, they come in with lots of expectations, and those expectations are usually unrealistically high. And I think all of us were expecting different things from Mr. Biden and his team following the years of chaos and confrontation that we saw in the previous administration of Mr. Trump. But I think the timing of this webinar this morning is really, really spot on. We've just had the C. Biden first meeting, albeit a virtual meeting, but that's a beginning. We've just seen the completion of COP26, and Singapore itself is moving away from heightened alerts and into a stabilization period coming out of COVID-19 and the management of the pandemic that we all know about and all experience. We've also seen high-level Biden administration visits, the Commerce Secretary and also the Trade Representative, who is currently in India. And this bodes well for economic engagement by the US administration with Southeast Asian states, something that was missing during the previous administration under Mr. Trump. So I want to pay tribute to Brunswick once again for working with us to bring you such an esteemed speaker as Bob Zoellick. And also I want to thank Joanna Dunn, who is a partner with the Brunswick Group here in Singapore. And Joanna will moderate the dialogue. And I'm sure it's going to be a very rich dialogue after Bob has given his opening address. At any time during the webinar, please feel free to type in your questions into the Q&A box, which you'll find in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You can upvote those questions that most appeal to you, and in doing so will make Joanna's job a bit easier as moderator. So feel free to do that. But for now, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to ask Bob Zoellick to address us. Bob, over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay. First, let me thank all of you for the opportunity to be with all of you. Thank Victor for the invitation, and Joanna and Adrian, my colleagues at Brunswick, for arranging. It's actually a wonderful privilege for me too. I have served on the Temasek board for 8 years. And so I am normally in Singapore once a quarter, but haven't been for 2 years. So I'm hoping to make it back in January, but it's a nice opportunity for me to hear about some of your interests. As Victor mentioned, I wanted to start before focusing on US-China relations and the possible implications for Singapore and Southeast Asia by taking a brief look at the bigger picture of Biden's foreign policy in his first year. So I worked for 8 years for a man named James Baker, who is, some of you may know, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Chief of Staff to Ronald Reagan, and then again, George H.W. Bush at the end. And in 1981, when Baker was Chief of Staff to Reagan, he said to the Mr. President, you've got 3 priorities: economic recovery, and economic recovery. Well, Biden had two key priorities when he took office earlier this year, and that's COVID and economic recovery. And it's important to keep in mind that will be determinative of his success in the midterm elections, or if he runs again, or his party will certainly run in 2024. But in addition, Biden came into office with a huge legislative agenda: economic stimulus, infrastructure, a long-term social economic package, voting rules, immigration, racial issues. Now, no president has had Biden's congressional experience since LBJ, and that positions him well for such an agenda. But as you know, he has a minuscule majority in the House. The Senate is evenly split, so he gets the deciding vote with the vice president. And his party covers a very wide-ranging coalition. And a legislative agenda like that takes a lot of a president's time. So it's not surprising that much of Biden's foreign policy has begun as a natural extension of his domestic agenda. And by this, I mean the so-called transnational issues, such as climate change, pandemic and future biological security, immigration, cyber issues. We could talk about these more if you'd like, but the performance is somewhat mixed. The missing piece of Biden's multilateralism is a trade policy, and he's held back by domestic politics. He doesn't want trade to become another fault line in the Democratic Congressional Caucus and with his party. So his logic is he has to focus on doing things at home first, but there's also a political logic holding him back. At the same time, Biden cannot avoid some of the traditional security issues, such as he faced in Afghanistan. Biden was long committed to withdraw from Afghanistan, dating back to his advice to President Obama at the time. In my view, the exit was handled poorly, although I think some of the commentary has been overwrought. And I'll cite as one of my sources of wisdom on this. I recall discussing Afghanistan with Lee Kuan Yew some 10 years ago. And at the time, he was quite vocal about believing it was a wasted venture. And he was quoting Kipling to me about the last soldier leaving, putting the rifle in his mouth. So I think in some ways, while it is undoubtedly a humanitarian tragedy, most Americans will say 20 years is enough and they'll move on unless ISIS or Al-Qaeda reconstitute Afghanistan as a base for international terrorism. And the reality is that the international terrorism agenda today is very different than it was 20 years ago. It focuses much more on intelligence, defense, disruption, and the terrain is much wider, including sub-Saharan Africa as well as Western Asia. The administration also will have to face the issue of the Iranian nuclear program as part of the security in the Persian Gulf. I think this will be very difficult. We'll have to see the position of the new Iranian government. And I think this will be an issue that will continue to draw the Biden administration's attention and to a degree frustration. And at the same time, the Biden administration has been seeking to repair relations with key allies, particularly in the Pacific and Europe, after Trump's transactional diplomacy. So let me turn now to the US policy towards China, which obviously is the one probably of greatest interest. I think, as you have seen, the administration was carried forward by a negative political momentum from Trump. So there's not much that Republicans and Democrats agree on these days, other than a hostility towards China. That's one of our few areas of bipartisanship. And the administration didn't want to look soft on China. My own view, but recognize I'm a minority on this, was that I think it dug a deep hole for itself because some of the officials that assumed important posts in the Biden administration declared that engagement had failed. It was their way of trying to sound forceful on China. I think that was factually incorrect. I could give you a long list of actions that were in the US interest. But the bigger problem that presents is, how then do you explain renewed engagement? If engagement failed, then what do you do next? And in some ways, the US Trade Representative Catherine Tai's statement after her policy review on China is symptomatic of this. There's a paragraph where she said, well, discussion failed, enforcement failed, the Trump trade package fell about 40% short. And then you look for the next paragraph to explain what she'll do, but it's missing. So that's the unanswered question. Now, for a time, the Biden administration could reasonably declare that it needed to focus on its legislative agenda at home, its strengthening the American economy, investment in technology, other security issues, and of course, to give priority to allies. And I think it had some success with this. We could discuss the origin of the AUKUS arrangement. I had an opportunity when Prime Minister Morrison of Australia was in Washington to discuss it with him personally. The Quad, I think, opens up a possibility for deeper cooperation with India. India will never be an alliance partner for historic and other reasons, but it clearly was shaken by the conflict on its border with China. And I think the Biden administration had good visits with the Japanese and Korean leaders after the frictions on trade and other issues of the Trump years. But, and this is the big but that Victor alluded to, the economic element is still missing. Now, I think in the early months, the administration slipped into a megaphone diplomacy with China. What I mean by that is both sides were exchanging charges and complaints, and there was the absence of a serious dialogue. I think Biden, to his credit, recognized this, and he recognized the risks of a downward spiral, and with that risk, the risks of miscalculation. So he suggested what I call an a la carte diplomacy. And what I mean by that is trying issue by issue to re-engage with China, starting with climate. President Xi responded coolly, as frankly I suspected he would, because as many of you know, China wants to have a conceptual understanding of the relationship. And of course, Xi has his own domestic politics that he was sensitive to, which we saw leading up to the recent Central Committee plenum, but even more importantly, the Party Congress in 2022. And that brings us to the video conference that just occurred. I think the fact of the meeting was more important than the results. Note, there was no agreed statement. It's not a peace agreement or even a ceasefire. I would describe it as a timeout. It was an opportune moment for the two leaders. Xi had just completed the Central Committee resolution on history, which was important to him in his position with the Pantheon with Mao and Deng. And Biden had just secured the passage of the infrastructure bill. So neither looked weak by holding the meeting. And from what one could tell, there seems to have been over 3 hours, some very serious interchange. And once you embark at the top level, it's harder to turn back. But so far, the objectives still look quite modest: to avoid unintended conflict, manage risks with guardrails. Most of the Western press overlooked the Chinese effort to create this conceptual framework that I mentioned. Now, I don't know how it was covered in Singapore, but the Vice Minister of the Foreign Ministry emphasized 3 principles, 4 priorities, 2 points of consensus, which were the importance of ties and avoiding the new Cold War, and 1 important issue, which of course was Taiwan. But there's no formal commitment to specific follow-up dialogues. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, refers to discussions of arms control, but the Chinese are rather vague on this. Other possibilities people have speculated it would be COVID or trade. However, here I want to come back to climate change. It's worth noting that even though the United States and China had a relatively weak statement in Glasgow, it was powerful in its effect. Having the US and China agree on something could send a very powerful signal. And I think to his credit, John Kerry always recognized this. So he was willing to try to take the political risk by forging ahead to try to have some cooperation with China. But this brings us back to the point that I mentioned. The Biden team is back to the problem of how does it explain its return to engagement. So far, the ideas are minimalist. They say not seeking to change China, coexistence, competition. as all of you know, these are terms, but the question is, how will the terms be brought into reality? So my bottom line is a meeting is better than no meeting, but this isn't a new dawn. Congressional and public opinion in the US remains very negative towards China. And there's no sign that Biden has tried to reset this, in part given all the other political challenges he has. In fact, the administration has added to the entity list sanctions, export controls. There have been bills put forward in Congress and even some discussion of executive action to limit US investment in China. The human rights issues in Hong Kong and Xinjiang remain very important. And you have security issues that get regular front page coverage here about hypersonic missiles and China moving beyond its minimum deterrence nuclear strategy of the past. Now, what's important to recognize, and this is often overlooked in Washington, is the other side gets a vote too. And what here, in addition to looking at the Biden administration in the US, I believe there's been a shift in Beijing's thinking as well. And recall, I do this from the context of that, I first visited China in 1980 when I was in Hong Kong. I was with Baker in China in 1991. After Tiananmen, we were trying to reset the relationship. I worked with China on its WTO accession. And then when I was at the State Department, I pushed this idea about China becoming a responsible stakeholder. I worked closely with China from the World Bank, and I, until COVID, was in China regularly. So I have some sense, but I have to admit I'm a little bit out of touch since I haven't been in China for the past couple of years. But what I see in a shift in Chinese thinking is Xi has concluded, unfortunately, that the US cannot accept China's rise. And therefore, standoff is a constant. But at the same time, China is approaching this with a mix of confidence, sometimes even hubris, but also some insecurity. The general view is the East is rising, the West declining. You've seen that phrase a lot. But at the same time, it's important to recall that the collapse of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union is not a historical event to Xi. It's a real warning. One of my favorite anecdotes was that when Xi Jinping took office, he created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union and directed all the party cadres to see it. Well, if such a film had been developed in Europe, Gorbachev would have been the hero that helped end the Cold War. The Chinese version's a little different. Gorbachev is the fool that abandoned the Communist Party, led to destruction of his country and ruin, and the not so subtle message is it's not going to happen here. And I'll share with you a personal anecdote. I got to know Xi when he was party secretary in Zhejiang province. He actually visited me when I was at the State Department. And I was out of government for a year before going to the World Bank. And I visited him in Hangzhou. And then I used to see him on occasion when he was vice president. So when he became president, I saw him and I was following up on some work we'd done at the World Bank with Liu Hu and the Development Research Council about the structural reforms out of China. And I said, Mr. President, what are your key priorities? And he said, the 86.68 million members of the Communist Party. Now that number, as you know, is probably in the low 90s now. But that always stuck with me, and perhaps I could remember it because the numbers were transversed. but I dealt with a lot of leaders, and if I'd asked any of them about their economic development plans, not one of them would have said their party membership. That was a rather revealing comment about where Xi's priority was. And so at the same time that we've got these economic changes going on, there's a wariness about foreign interference. Xi's looking towards the Party Congress in 2022. I think the shutdown has exacerbated this. I don't think there have been the interchange in context. This does not mean that China, and you know this well, is withdrawing internationally. I think the dual circulation policy is actually a mix of internal strengthening, but also leverage and with others internationally. But I think the key point is that I don't think Xi is as focused on a cooperative dialogue with the US as China was during some of my tenure. I think their priority is avoiding miscalculation and misperceptions that could lead to conflict, especially as they look to the Winter Olympics, the 2022 Party Congress. And these are the core issues you hear mentioned, whether it's Taiwan or CCP control or South China Sea issues that they see are key to their security. I also see there's in some ways a overlap between some of the economic decoupling that's come from the US side and the dual circulation. In particular, I'm somewhat concerned we're moving towards separate systems on technology and data. I think the traditional economic linkages are too strong, too large to break. And frankly, the financial flows and capital are probably somewhere in between. I think that's going to be a sensitive area to watch. So let me close with some implications for Southeast Asia. I have always perceived links between the political economy trade issues with the wider security issues. So it's quite coincidental, but I started working and thinking about the ASEAN countries years ago and have tried to recognize the ongoing importance of that as a group. My first visit to Singapore was in 1989 or 1990 when we launched APEC, which had been launched in '89 in Australia. And frankly, the free trade agreements that I negotiated when I was U.S. Trade Representative were in part a way to try to sort of build what I hoped would become the type of regional network that the Trans-Pacific Partnership became. And even the Quad, some of you may know, actually grew out of the assistance to Indonesia after the tsunami. So I have a sense of how this region needs to be part of a larger network. Unfortunately, the Biden administration is stalled on trade. I think, as we've noted, it's good that some of the senior people in the administration have been able to visit. I hope that will help them see the importance of the economic and security link. And what I have believed from my exposure to Singapore is a rapidly changing regional economy as well. And here I'll mention, Joanna and I were talking, I think the Secretary of Commerce visiting Singapore is quite important. Secretary Raimondo is a respected member of the cabinet, successful governor of Rhode Island, but also a person who had background in business and private equity. And I think that she would be a person who would be open to the types of discussions that I hope she had with her Singapore colleagues. My own sense of where this will go is some ways similar to the interview that Prime Minister Lee gave at the Bloomberg Forum, which is, I think the administration will have difficulty moving on the traditional trade topics. So they'll look for mutual interest in terms of climate, biological security, as they were doing with the Quad, perhaps something in the digital area and changing supply chains. And in the climate area, I would hope that would also include adaptation as well as carbon mitigation. In my work with many emerging market countries, I think that the adaptation and resilience agenda will be very important. And obviously, given the low-lying areas in much of Southeast Asia, I think that will be an important part of the agenda. I think the US would be wise to pay close attention to Indonesia. All of you know the importance of Indonesia and ASEAN. There's also a focus on Vietnam, and Vietnam is handling this very sensitive, as well as the traditional treaty allies of Thailand and the Philippines. I would also, if I were giving advice on this, I would also focus on possible associations through the multilateral institutions. When I was at the World Bank from 2007 to 2012, I wanted to draw Singapore more into the multilateral system. And I actually created a hub in Singapore in part to experiment with pilots for infrastructure where we put in money from our private sector arm, IFC, Singapore put in money. And the idea was whether we could move from one-off infrastructure transactions to a deal flow and try to understand where the public money could move forward. Unfortunately, I think my successor dismantled some of that, but I think the idea of the multilaterals helping with some of the transnational issues or global public goods like climate or biological security, new platform economies could still be very valuable. I'll tell you frankly, I don't think these are yet on the Biden administration screen, but perhaps they will be. And I think one of the challenges for the region, as I've alluded to, is the risk of being caught between the decoupling and the dual circulation, especially on the data fragmentation issue. I'd highlight the data issue most of all, as you probably are well aware. You started to see the goods trade growth level off around 2008, but services trade was really booming even well before COVID. From 2008 on. And from what I've seen in my own business links and from the data, that was just been accelerated by the pandemic. But that raises the question of data fragmentation, and the geopolitics that we're discussing obviously makes that a much more complex issue. For those of you with doing businesses that have important links to the US, whether they're dollar clearing or other parts of markets, one has to be very watchful of the danger of what I'll call the compliance contradictions, where you get caught with sanctions from one, but the Chinese orders on the other. And this will be a time that I would even be more careful than you probably were in the past about the political sensitivities. So I also served at the Treasury Department once in my career, and which is the coordinator for the CFIUS process, the foreign investment process. And I served on CFIUS when I was US Trade Representative. Over the past 5 years, the CFIUS remit has expanded. The staffing is much larger. There used to be companies would bring issues for CFIUS for review. Now CFIUS is reaching out, including some cases to foreign companies investing in the United States, but that also have business in China. So this is an area to be sensitive about. The bottom line here for the Singapore International Chamber of Commerce is I think it'll be useful to have a continuous process of scanning these political, economic, security sort of context. Singapore remains at the heart of this as a global port city. From some of my experience, including at Temasek, I think Singapore is also in a transition from being a global port city to being a global platform city. And that obviously links you back to the data issues. And it's also a city that's at the intersection of these transnational topics, whether it's climate or biological security or data and cybersecurity. So it's an exciting moment, but also an edgy moment. But as everybody on this call knows, Singapore has long experience with both. So Joanna, I'd be happy to take your questions or that of the audience.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Bob. And thank you to Victor and the Chamber for having Brunswick here today and for your kind words earlier. We always really enjoy these sessions. And as Victor said, my job as moderator is hopefully going to be easy because I know we're going to get some great questions. So please do put them in the chat and I'll make sure that I ask Bob them in the next hour or so. Bob, I mean, thank you very much for your opening remarks. I think they set the scene beautifully for us. I'm just going to go into some of it in a bit more detail and particularly on the sort of US China side of things. I think I mean, you know, those of us sitting in this region feel that you can't really have a conversation on US Indo-Pacific strategy without, you know, checking in on the status of US China. You gave us an excellent summary in terms of some of the developments we've seen with, you know, the COP26 declaration and obviously the virtual meeting, which got a lot of attention. Appreciate there have been mixed reactions to this, but you know, it does feel, at least tonally, that this has improved somewhat compared to, say, the Alaska meetings earlier this year, albeit we didn't see any you know, concrete agreements or statements of progress in terms of some of the sort of key areas of tension. We had Prime Minister Lee here referring to it as a necessary beginning, so an important first step. By the same token, I think Dr. Kissinger referred to it more dramatically as sort of the two countries standing on the edge of a precipice, and they have a decision to make in terms of where to go next. So I think, you know, it really is still creating a huge amount of uncertainty in terms of what will happen next. And for businesses, you know, part of this chamber sitting here in ASEAN that straddle both of these countries, that's really difficult. I suppose I just wanted to ask you, you know, what is your sense in terms of what we might expect to see next? What's the timescales for some of that, and what might determine that direction? And you touched on this a bit, but you know, how much do you think that you know, a move for more engagement, you know, how do you think this will play out for President Biden back home? So how much latitude does he really have to walk back from the precipice and to actually do things differently? So yeah, if you could just share a few comments on that, that would be great.
So it's interesting, Joanna, tomorrow for me, so it's your day for you. I take part in a small group with Dr. Kissinger discussing these exact issues, but it's in part because we're both contrarians now. So, and therefore you have to discount what I say or he warns. And the point of it is that both of us think that it's unrealistic to try to contain China, that a approach of just condemnation or conflict is not going to produce anything useful. But you have to recognize that if you were looking at the news reporting in the United States about China, our view would be seen as old and traditional, and that we fail to recognize the danger that Xi has provided. And keep in mind here, you get it from both the left and the right. The left has got it from the human rights issues, and clearly, you know, Xi has been more aggressive, as one saw in Hong Kong and other issues. And then the right sees it from security and the wolf warrior diplomacy, and the Chinese hypersonic missiles and the bullying. And I actually had a good meeting with the new Chinese ambassador to the United States, who was kind of one of the wolf warriors as when he was public affairs official. And you know, he said to me, "Look, I'm in a different job now." You know, I tried to make the point that obviously he had his credentials for being tough secured at home, so now he needed to try to reach out a little bit more, and he understands that point. But the context here still remains very negative and hostile. Now, having said that, I think the good part of the meeting, as I mentioned, was that it occurred, and I think it's positive that Biden recognized that the U.S. approach, while it suited certain political constituencies in the United States, was raising risks of miscalculation. And I'll just say, I'll give you a specific example, because a lot of diplomacy then comes down to the specifics. When Secretary Blinken had his confirmation hearings, people may recall, he said that the Chinese were guilty of genocide. Now, frankly, I think there's actually some dispute among the lawyers of the State Department whether that definition fits. But setting aside the legal issue, if one were going to say that, one would have to recognize that that's pushing a very hot button in China. And you couldn't be surprised if, when you're in Anchorage, that the Chinese would hit back. So this is one of the choices that somebody like Tony we had to make going into his confirmation. If he didn't say genocide, he'd be criticized for being too soft. But frankly, if he were thinking about working ahead with China, he might have talked about the human rights violations, might have said, you know, the terrible things about Xi, so on and so forth, but not use the genocide word. So what we saw for the first 8 or 9 months was, as I mentioned, a lot of rhetorical bomb tossing from both sides. And for a while, people like Kurt Campbell, who's helping guide the policy for Sullivan and others, could justifiably say, well, we need to rebuild some of our alliance relations, and they took some steps in that. But I think it was getting to the point, particularly with Taiwan, that you were reaching danger. And so in that sense, Biden's recognition and the first sort of contact, I think is better than the alternative. But what I again underscore is, don't mistake this for a new dawn. You know, it's not peace, it's not a ceasefire, it's a timeout. And with Joanna, as you know, when we often talk about policy issues, I try to identify what I would watch. Okay, so the things to watch would be, what types of follow-up does one have on any of these topics? Whether it be climate, whether it be trade or economics, whether it be biological security. So let's take biological security. As again, people in Singapore are probably well aware, the frequency of these breakouts has been increasing in number and in cost. And it's directly related to the wildlife, to livestock, the human connectivity and urbanization processes, significantly in Southeast Asia and parts of South Asia. Some people might find this possibility in Africa too. So it would certainly make sense that the United States and others would try to work with China to identify, how do we try to understand the zoonotic viruses, what genetic testing can we do, how can we have prevention, how can we have monitoring. But the approach that was taken in the last year of the Trump administration was just to blame China. And of course, China, under its closed system, created opportunities for being blamed. It wasn't sharing information. But you have to ask yourself, if you really want to deal with this, is there a way to try to find some mutual interest without pushing the other one into a corner? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's where multilateral institutions can sometimes help play a process. The problem here is the WHO has been lost some of its legitimacy. But what I'm suggesting to you is, if I were going to work on future international financial markets, how could the IMF play sort of a certain convening role in this? If we're dealing with debt problems in some of the developing countries. And ultimately, this will depend on whether Ambassador Tai and others in the administration decide to go back with China on more of a managed trade approach, which was the Trump approach, or whether you want to try to address some of the internal problems. So again, to be specific, perhaps many of the companies that are part of this project have had certain frustrations with China. When I and others made the case to China, China started to set up intellectual property rights courts. And at least the information I had was that they were finding for foreigners about 85 to 90% of the time, but the penalties weren't high. So you should be pushing on higher penalties. And then frankly, I think some of the interpretations of those courts over the past year have gotten more negative for foreign firms, and it isn't surprising in an acrimonious environment. If you're worried about forced technology transfer, which is prohibited by China's Working Party report, the challenge I found in the trade representative's office was that we couldn't get companies to bring us the evidence because they were afraid of retaliation. So I would probably focus on reducing joint venture requirements, because that's a temptation for these. So that's what I'm describing to you, is the hard work of trying to find mutual interest in an integration process. But that's different than certainly a containment or a decoupling process, right? And so I'm just being frank with people. I don't think the administration has really faced that question internally. In fact, what they've been struggling with more is the one that kind of you opened with, and also Victor, which is given the trade politics, how can they start to do something more with partners across East Asia? So one topic that I have suggested, including to Ambassador Tai, is, well, if you can't rejoin the TPP, which I wish we could, can we do something in the digital space? And there are digital provisions in the USMCA. There's digital provisions in some of the agreements with Japan. Singapore has been part of this. This was actually an idea that Singapore had also promoted. But we'll just have to see whether the administration is willing to pick up on some of those. So those are the types of items that I would be on watch for, but it's too early to predict.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I guess sort of moving to sort of further south in the world, I wanted to talk a bit about Australia for a couple of reasons. One, I'd like to get your views on AUKUS, which you know, got a lot of attention in this part of the world. We saw quite mixed reactions to it actually from ASEAN countries. You know, countries like Indonesia and Malaysia came out quite strongly against it. The Philippines, on the other hand, was more in favor of it. I mean, it feels like Washington's willingness to share such sort of, you know, sensitive nuclear technology is quite a dramatic shift in policy. And I'd be interested, you know, what do you think was really behind this? And, you know, do you expect that we might see these kind of agreements repeated with other regional allies? You talked about them wanting to deepen relationships with regional allies. And how do you think, I mean, there was a sense that China was somewhat surprised by this actually. What do you think, I mean, how do you think they are assessing and responding to it?
So I think the most important part of AUKUS is one that you touched on, Joanna, which is it's important to see it as more than an agreement on nuclear submarines. The heart of this is defense technology sharing over a much longer time frame. And it was fortuitous, but when Prime Minister Morrison came to the US, I was part of a small dinner with him, and it's quite clear that he was the catalyst for this. He'd been thinking about these steps even back in the Trump administration. But interestingly, and if he'd presented them to the Trump administration, he knew they would have been supportive. But he wasn't sure that the Trump administration would have the bureaucratic leverage to ensure implementation by the defense security community here. And for those people that are aware of this, our Defense Department, and in particular the US Navy, has been very protective of these types of technologies. And so the longer term issue here will be the types of cooperation that the three countries, and perhaps others, can build in areas like quantum computing, sort of undersea capabilities, different types of missile development, as well as submarines. Now, this will depend very heavily on the implementation over time, because when bureaucracies are resistant, as we all know, it takes a while to move them. In that sense, it was significant that the Biden administration just announced an appointment of somebody on the NSC staff, Miller, who was supposed to, a former Undersecretary of Defense, to be pushing and driving this. I think that's a good sign. Now, the related issue, of course, is the submarines do matter. So if you look at the composition of nuclear submarine fleets, I don't have the numbers directly in front of me, but 8 Australian submarines, nuclear submarines, is quite important given the overall mix. China will be building more. Then the question that Australia, the US, and Britain face is Australia doesn't now have this nuclear submarine capacity. And it's quite complex in terms of the building and maintenance. And so this will be a priority to watch over the next year or two, is to see how quickly the United States and Australia and Britain can move to start to develop these capabilities for building and maintaining such a fleet. But so in some ways, I think, Joanna, this is an idea that developed out of the Five Eyes intelligence relationship even more than the traditional security community. And that's the bond that sort of created this opportunity. On the British side, I know there's some dispute about this, but frankly, I've also been working with Britain leaders as you think about leaving the EU. And I think it's good for Britain to be positioned globally. And I think it's smart for Australia to have Britain in, because as they negotiate these submarines, frankly, it's an asymmetrical relationship with the US, but if you've got Britain, you actually have another alternative. And that's probably healthy for all three parties over time. So the devil will be in the details, but I recently was at an event where I saw Kurt Campbell, who is one of the driving forces along with Jake Sullivan on this. And they know this is a key priority that they have to follow through on the implementation. But this is kind of an inside bureaucratic observation, but the foreign policy in this administration does seem to emanate much from the White House, and the White House, including NSC staff. And there's always a challenge in our administrations that do that, which is the execution, because the execution has to come through the departments. So that's a smaller inside issue to watch.
Thank you, thank you. And I suppose a sort of.
Oh, and by the way, you mentioned the ASEAN piece. I do. So Morrison and others are recognizing that this will also require some sensitive handling with the key ASEAN countries. And the one that you highlighted and all of us always know is important was Indonesia. The Indonesian leadership, Jokowi, has tended to be, I think, more internally focused than externally focused. And that's always an important determinant of Indonesia's sort of place in the ASEAN system. But I think that one of the successes over the past 10 to 20 years is the deeper relationship that Australia and Indonesia have built. And I hope that will sustain this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was going to say, I mean, it feels like there's a natural segue to this, on the topic of regional stability and security is Taiwan, which is obviously something that is causing considerable anxiety for people, companies, countries in this region. It feels like Taiwan independence, and indeed, I suppose, the sort of defense of it has become an increasingly hot button issue, and more so than before. We've obviously seen China building up its military capability and really ramping up pressure. I suppose, it's the $1 million question, but what is your sense on when China and perhaps more personally when President Xi might make a move for unification, or what do you think are the things, the red lines, etc., that would make him really compelled to make that move? And what do you think? We had the sixth plenum just a few weeks ago, and this idea of President Xi's legacy, how much does Taiwan feature in that? And to what extent do you think that timescale is, associated with that legacy?
So for those on the call that are particularly interested in this, the best single paper that I would recommend is one done by two friends of mine, Bob Blackwell and Phil Zelikow, who did a study on this for the Council on Foreign Relations. So there's a little, 80 or 90 page pamphlet. But the reason I recommend it is that it goes beyond the headlines and slogans to look at some of the operational aspects for both the US and China of this issue. But as a starting point, I think this probably is the issue that led President Xi to decide that he would be willing to have this video conference with President Biden, because in the words of actually one of my Chinese friends, they heard Biden's statements about not changing the policy, although Biden mangled that a couple times, but they saw actions that conflicted with it. And particularly going through to the 2022 Party Congress, I think this is a very hot button issue for Xi. And again, I've mentioned this a couple of times, but I can't emphasize this enough. In Western countries, we often think about our political constraints. One has to recognize what Xi is doing here, to move from third term and likely, unrestricted sort of power and his centralization is a very big move. And so he doesn't want to have anything upset that. I have always believed that if Taiwan declared independence, that would be a red line. I don't think that Xi or other Chinese leaders could accept that. And there were statements in the Trump administration that basically seemed to be calling for this. And I think it was unduly provocative. Now, what the Blackwell and Zelikow paper tries to point out is, from a point of view of US interest, I think the US has an interest in trying to preserve Taiwan's autonomy, its market system, its democracy, not only for the values, but because Taiwan has an important role in the first island chain. And that if Taiwan lost that autonomy, you would probably have ripple effects on your other key alliance partners, particularly Japan. But at the same time, I think the US has to be careful to make the point that Taiwan should not cross the line to independence, because that would be a provocative action. There are also issues, of course, that have filtered in the US debate that, Taiwan spends about 2% of its GDP on national defense. That's not anywhere near what the US spends. And how they spend it has also been a question, because the defense community in Taiwan has tended to stick with the old strategy of being able to attack China, where frankly, what it really needs is a lot of caves and a lot of missiles and a lot of submersibles to basically sort of hold out. Now, the point operationally that I want to draw to people's attention, though, and this is where this paper is quite good, is that if there is an event with Taiwan, it doesn't necessarily have to be a traditional invasion. There are Taiwanese islands in the South China Sea. There's other Taiwanese islands. There's various other ways that China could send a signal. And then it's a question of what will be the response of Taiwan or the US and others. The one that I think is most serious would be a strategy that looks like the quarantine of Cuba in 1962. So what I mean by that is, you could imagine that Chinese forces could say, we'll allow trade to come back into Taiwan, but we're not going to allow any military supplies. Just like the US in 1962 said, we're not going to allow missiles. They didn't stop everything. They didn't stop tankers and other things. Now, the trick on that is it then pushes the decision on escalation to the United States. Do you accept that? Or do you threaten the quarantine? One thing is quite clear from an operational side, which is that the US options to deal with that depend very heavily on Japan. The forces in Japan, Japan's involvement, all those are critical. And that's why in watching the Taiwan issue, it's also important to watch this in the discussion of Japanese politics. And you'll see that in one of the Japanese US statements, there was a sort of a reference to the area with Taiwan. I think this is quite complicated on the Japanese side, because I don't think the Japanese public is very sensitive about being drawn into these types of security questions. On the other hand, the Japanese security thinkers are well aware that if Taiwan did lose its autonomy, it would have a significant shock on Japan's own sense of security. And going back to the Chinese decisions, this shock on Japan could also lead to changes in, say, nuclear policy. So this is China's calculations have to be much more than military. And there are people who say that China observed that Putin took over Crimea and he had some sanctions, but it wasn't that devastating. Taiwan is not Crimea by population and attitude of the population and others. So in my own view is this was risky. There's danger involved. It's not a high probability event, but it's one worth paying close attention to from both sides. And this is probably the prime issue that fell in the category of miscalculation or mistake that it's important for the two parties to discuss. But having said all that, if Taiwan were seen as moving to independence or the US were supporting that, I do think that Beijing would be forced to react.
Thank you very much. Bob, at the beginning, you talked about, in order to understand sort of Biden's foreign policy, you needed to look at what his, what his sort of key issues were. back home, and you mentioned COVID and economic recovery. We've got here a sort of the mirror question of that for China, which is, you know, what impact do you expect the Chinese domestic economic slowdown might have on China's foreign policy? You just spend some time on that.
Well, I'll pick up a variation of it, which you and I were talking about, which is, I think, just as Singapore has now decided on a careful opening up strategy, I think 2022 is going to be very tricky for China, because it's had such a strong suppression strategy that the population has not been infected to a high enough percentage to sort of build immunities separate from the vaccine. And then, of course, there'll be a debate on the effectiveness of the Chinese vaccine versus the Pfizer and the Moderna and others. And of course, then there's booster shots and so on and so forth. And I think one of the issues that the Singapore government had to face in opening up was what combination of vaccinations and percentage of people that would be immunized through infection would allow one to move on in a more endemic fashion. And I know in part from talking with some of the Singaporeans, this is also a calculation of what hospitals you had, kind of age groups. So, you know, some people said, you know, the Israelis had the best strategy, which is, you know, lock up everybody over 65 like me, and then encourage young people to party so that you manage to spread the issue. But so if you apply that to China, I don't have the data, but I think it's going to be a challenge for China with the medical facilities in this transition. And I think this complicates economic and political ties. So people probably observe this in Singapore too. The Chinese leadership, you know, is careful about sort of going out. So I guess Wang Qishan came for the Bloomberg meeting, but Xi's been very careful. I think this again, as they get through the Winter Olympics, as they get through, you know, the Party Congress, they'll need to handle a transition of this. But in the meantime, I think one of the unfortunate aspects of the centralization of power under Xi is that the normal channels of communication are probably more restricted than they have been under other Chinese leaders. I don't think in this environment too many people want to report bad news up to the top. And everybody here knows the Chinese system quite well. When foreigners come into China, there's meticulous note taking. So by the time you're at one meeting, by the time you go to the next one, they've already made notes and sent them on so people know the basis of the discussion. And so foreigners can engage the leaders on some of these topics, not they necessarily convince them, but they share information. That's been very restricted for 2 years. And as everyone knows, there's limits to what you can do in Zoom land versus sort of direct contact. So I think this will be a challenge to watch with China over the course of 2022. I think, you know, again, when you look at the different components of China's changing development strategy, you've got the common prosperity aspect, and a lot of that's trying to focus on what is perceived as the inequalities and sort of helping parts of the society that haven't benefited as much. The dual circulation is in part to deal with self-sufficiency, but also how China wants to get leverage internationally. And I think the new industrial policy, which is heavily technology oriented, is another dimension. So when you can see, you know, for all the talk about the Chinese internet companies, they're a rather small part of Chinese GDP. And it's not that by any means that China's rejecting technology, it's trying to redirect the technology towards certain sectors, and as opposed to the consumer side. And in some ways, it's almost looking at sort of a German model of industrial development, sort of adding the technology dimension on it. And so I think there's a coherence to this, and it's actually interesting if you if you think of some of the things that China's trying to deal with in terms of inequalities, trying to, the abuses of what it considers to be some of the social media aspect, there's actually echoes in the US and sort of the Western world of these issues. But I think it's important to understand the underlying drivers. The demographic challenge for China does loom large for the leadership as they look ahead. And so just to take one example, I think my friend George Yo, who I think has participated in this group before, told me that about 90% of the free family cash flow is spent on education. And so that, I think that gives you an insight on the closing down some of the private tutoring, is that they were worried that the sort of need to spend large sums of money on education or private tutoring were probably contributing to the demographic slowdown. People are afraid they couldn't afford this. And so the demographic issue combined with some of the fact that Xi does have an ideological view of his place within the pantheon, where there's, I don't know how this is looked at in Singapore. In the US, people often look at Marxist, Leninist writings and it just all looks like a jumble to them, but it's real for Xi. And for Xi, he has a historical determinism of history, and it's important that the party writes history, as we just saw over the past week. And Mao is the figure that helped China stand up. Deng is the figure that helped to get rich, and now he's moving China to be powerful. So there's a scheme to this, and it's important that people understand the nature of that scheme. But bringing it back to the foreign policy area, Xi has his own challenges and his own plate full on these issues, and he doesn't want a further disruption from the US as he's at this sensitive phase.
Thank you very much. Coming back to Singapore, I mean, in terms of US-China tensions, Singapore is somewhat caught between, one of its most important security partners on the one hand, and then its largest trading partners on the other. We've got a question here. How should a Singapore-based company operate in such a geopolitical climate to avoid being caught in trade conflicts?
Very carefully. And in more seriousness, it depends on one's position in China and the importance of the US. From the US side, the attention to sanctions and compliance is serious and real. So watch out for it. And so, make sure that your compliance team cuts across your various verticals, make sure that you are at least aware of the decisions that you're making if it's going to affect your position with US. Obviously, for financial institutions, it's even more sensitive for the dollar clearing. But I'm highlighting this particularly on the technology side. And I wish I could be more definite about this, but it's too hard to tell. You can see the restrictions building on the technology side. I've made the point that almost all modern businesses that I deal with are heavily dependent on data systems. And so if there becomes a sensitivity to data sharing across China and the US, it is going to have a fundamentally decoupling effect. Now, does that mean, does one need to consider corporate structures that reflect this difference? I know some European companies that are at least thinking about this and proceeding about this process. And so at this point, Joanna, I think what I just emphasize is one of my closing points. You need to don't take anything for granted. Don't take the past as a determinant. The CFIUS process of 3 years ago is not the CFIUS process of today. And so, this is the types of areas where you want to make sure that you're consulting knowledgeable people and staying in touch with that, depending on the particular issue that you're talking about.
Thank you. You mentioned in your opening remarks Afghanistan. Vice President Harris was actually in Singapore during the week of the US withdrawal. And And I think it somewhat dominated her trip, perhaps unfortunately for her, given what I imagine were her sort of original objectives from that trip. We've got a question here. How much does the pullout from Afghanistan reduce US prestige from the Indo-Pacific viewpoint? What has it done for trust, and how much has it emboldened China and other states?
Yeah, I alluded to this briefly. When your performance isn't as competent as it should be, it's never a good day, right? So that aspect is a negative. From my conversations with people of the administration, I don't think they deserve to be criticized for a lack of consultation with European allies. There were lots of consultations. Frankly, there was just a difference of view, and Biden was quite committed on pulling out. I think what happened in particular was I think they were unprepared for the rapidity of the collapse. And one little insight is when the collapse occurred, check out where many of the leading officials were on vacation. If they thought things were going to fall apart right away, they wouldn't necessarily be away. These are difficult to predict. And I think what happened is the US military, which remains a very efficient organization, got the clear message from Biden, and so then it proceeded to do things operationally. And I think personally, there was a lack of coordination then on the diplomatic side about what the effects would that be on remaining confidence in the Afghan government and getting people out. Having said that, I would be careful about overstating it. So, and again, in a practical, realistic sense, will Japan become less reliant on US for security because of this? I don't think so. Will South Korea, will Australia? That's just not realistic. And even in the European case, keep in mind, President Macron talked about strategic autonomy. Europeans have been talking about that for a long time. In some ways, I wish they would develop it. But when you look at the French forces in the Sahel, they're very dependent on US intelligence, logistics, and air support. And so the reality is, if you're Poland and you're worried about, or the Baltics, and you're worried about Russia, who are you going to look to? France, Germany, or the US, right? And so those are the power sort of realities. So I'm not saying that it was good, but there's sometimes people get a little overwrought on this. And as for the reality in the region, now the neighbors are going to have to deal with Afghanistan as much as the US. And so that's unfortunate for India. It's not good for Pakistan. It's not good for Russia. It's not good for the Stans. It's not good for Iran. And it's not so good for China. And the US, I believe, still has humanitarian responsibilities. But I don't mean to be hard-edged about this, but the US departure from Vietnam was much more destabilized or tragic than others, and look how that got sort of turned around here. And again, it was just coincidental. I had got to meet Lee Kuan Yew many years ago, and I would always see him when I would come. And I remembered as I was preparing for this event how he was basically saying 10 years ago, why are you still there?
Thank you. Well, we're nearly out of time. I've got one last question from the audience for you, which I suppose is sort of future looking, but what do you think would be the most positively impactful way for the Biden administration to engage with Southeast Asia? What does ASEAN most want from the US, and is the US willing to provide it?
Yes, that's a good question. And the way you phrased it, I could answer it, but I'm not sure that it gives you good guidance. So look, I've built much of my career on the political economy issues. I pressed most of the free trade agreements that the United States has. So I think, as I've suggested, the United States ideally would rejoin TPP. If it couldn't do that, it would do a digital accord with a number of the same countries. But Absent that, I hope that the Biden administration will find some ways, whether with infrastructure or other aspects of the agenda that I mentioned today, or Prime Minister Lee, to engage in the region. But then this is where you have to get country specific. So, I think the relationships, obviously, Singapore is a key partner, but spending time focusing on Indonesia and Vietnam would be high on my list. And I think the administration is trying to pay attention to Vietnam. I think, as I've heard from some administration officials, the interpersonal relationship between the Vietnamese leaders and the US leaders is still a little rough and rudimentary. The cross-cultural political systems aren't as sort of well developed. But I think this is one that, Vietnam will be careful, but I think that's important. And as we've all talked about, the Indonesian finance minister, Sri Mulyani, was my colleague at the World Bank. I know a lot of people in Indonesia that understand, I think, the benefits that the US economic relationship can provide. And so that's an important area of investment. People on this call are probably more aware than I am of the fissures within ASEAN these days related to Myanmar and others, but they're sort of real. But it starts with the point of show up, listen, and often you can find small things that can, that demonstrate some attentiveness to the other party's agenda. And, Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, once made a comment that I never liked, but is somewhat true, which is when he was, after his re-election, he was asked, what are your plans for the future? And he said, events, dear boy, events. And I never liked that, because I like leaders to try to be thinking ahead. But how leaders respond to events is important. So I mentioned the tsunami with Indonesia. I remember going to Aceh and then to Jakarta and others when I was at that time with the State Department, and we worked with a number of the development institutions. And Pak Kantura was the person who helped coordinate it. There was quite for a huge tragedy, it was quite a success. So when there are events like that, you need to show up and be attentive and try to be of assistance. The other piece of this puzzle, though, for Southeast Asia will, of course, be India. And there, I think the development of the Quad offers potential. One doesn't want to overstate it, as I've said. This is not an alliance. This is not a new NATO. But the approach the administration has taken with the Quad is to try to come up with a constructive agenda, for example, vaccines. And I think now they've pledged 1 billion vaccines for Southeast Asia, and to do that in concert with India. And that's an agenda that others can build on and be part of. So I think, frankly, some of the key people of the administration are alert to the issue. Kurt Campbell knows Singapore and ASEAN quite well. They're somewhat constrained on the trade topic, so they'll look for some of these other issues. And what this means for Singapore and others is sometimes there's opportunity if you bring in ideas. So if there's something in the climate space or others, I've watched Singapore take a much more active position on some of the climate issues over the past few years. They may be able to be a catalyst for some ideas that could be good for ASEAN and good for the relationship.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for your brilliant questions. With that, I think I'm handing back to Victor for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Joanna. And thank you, Bob. Really appreciate your time, your insights, and the sad truth that, yes, it's great that President Biden and President Xi Jinping are talking, but it's not, as you said, a new dawn. One can only hope that the sort of same collaborative approach that you can see that was behind the Quad and other initiatives can be extended to China in the fullness of time. And I like very much the contextualization of the constraints that both political leaders are under. I mean, President Biden has got the midterm elections in 2022, and President Xi Jinping has got that all-important party congress in late 2022. And events, dear boy, events do play a big part in how leaders respond, and also in the context in which they have to respond. So Bob, thank you so much. It's been terrific to host you. We hope to see you again soon in person in Singapore. And in closing, I want to thank Joanna for an expert job at moderation, and also to Brunswick for its convening and enabling power to bring us all together. It's been wonderful. My last word is for Bob, to wish you a happy Thanksgiving on Thursday. I hope you have a nice family time, and thank everybody on the call for joining us.
So Victor,
thank you so much.
I want to thank you, but also then say that, so sometime when I'm back in Singapore for one of my Temasek meetings, we should poll your members if they want to do something in person.
Absolutely, and we would love to do that. It would be terrific. So whenever you're back in town, let's make sure we deliver that.
Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. Bob, thank you. Joanna, many thanks again. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you. If we can be of any help, just drop us a note to here-to-help@sicc.com.sg. Let us know what topics, themes you want us to cover, particularly as we complete planning for 2022. But from now, from me and all my team, it's goodbye. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.